The sky burned above the ruined city, thick plumes of smoke twisting into the heavens as the last remnants of the once mighty Dominion forces lay scattered across the ground. The war had ended here, on this broken world, where the final screams of the fallen had faded into silence. The air smelled of scorched metal and blood, the echoes of destruction still whispering through the wreckage. Captain Daniel Carter stood at the edge of the battlefield, his combat armor smeared with dirt and plasma burns. His pulse rifle hung loosely in his grip, its power cell depleted, though there was no need for it now. The enemy had surrendered. It was over. The Galactic Dominion had ruled over dozens of species for centuries, enslaving, conquering, expanding, until they met humanity. Humans were not like the others. They fought with a ferocity no Dominion strategist had ever predicted. They did not break, they did not kneel, and when pushed to the brink, they became monsters. The war had been brutal, stretching across years, but now the Dominion had fallen. Victory had come at a price. Cities reduced to rubble, ships torn apart in orbit, countless lives lost on both sides. Yet, as Daniel surveyed the scene, he felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion. A sudden movement caught his eye. The last few surviving Dominion officials, escorted by human soldiers, were being brought forward under heavy guard. The tallest among them, an elder with deep sapphire skin and piercing golden eyes, walked with the rigid pride of someone who had once commanded empires. He was clothed in ceremonial robes that had once symbolized power, though now they hung tattered, mere remnants of a lost era. The alien stopped before Daniel, his gaze calm despite the reality of his situation. There was no pleading, no hatred, only something else, something unreadable. "You are Carter, the butcher of Ilaris." The elder spoke, his voice steady. Daniel had heard the name before. He despised it. The media had coined it after one of the war's bloodiest battles, where his forces had decimated an entire Dominion fleet. They made it sound like he had enjoyed it, as if it had been anything other than a necessity. "I'm just a soldier," Daniel said flatly. The elder let out a slow breath. Then, without warning, he stepped aside, and from behind him, a figure emerged. She was nothing like Daniel expected. She moved with quiet grace, her silken silver hair cascading over delicate shoulders, her violet eyes shimmering with an intensity that was both piercing and unreadable. Her skin was a pale blue, marked with faint bioluminescent patterns that pulsed subtly, betraying an underlying nervousness. She wore the remains of what had once been an ornate Dominion gown, though it was tattered from war, dirt, and dried blood staining the fabric. She walked forward, slowly, deliberately, and then, to Daniel's shock, she knelt. "She is yours," the elder said simply. Daniel frowned. "What?" "This is the custom of our people," the elder continued, his tone carrying the weight of something ancient and immutable. "When warriors of the Dominion surrender, they offer a final tribute to their conquerors. She is our tribute to you." A chill ran through Daniel's spine. He looked down at the woman kneeling before him, her head slightly bowed but her expression neutral. "I don't need a tribute," Daniel said coldly. "The war is over. Take your people and go." The elder did not seem surprised by his response. If anything, he looked resigned. "She cannot leave. It is not her choice, nor is it yours." Daniel's fingers twitched. His gut told him there was more to this than tradition. There was something else happening beneath the surface, something he wasn't seeing yet. He turned his attention back to the woman. "What's your name?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, softly, she spoke. "Zyrella." Her voice was smooth, melodic, but laced with something else, something restrained. Daniel let out a slow breath, glancing at the elder once more. "I'm not keeping a prisoner. If this is your idea of surrender, you can shove it." The elder shook his head. "This is not a matter of surrender. It is a matter of honor. She was chosen. She cannot return to her people, nor can she wander alone. Her fate is now tied to yours." Zyrella remained still, her expression betraying nothing but Daniel caught it. The faint flicker in her gaze, a sliver of something buried deep. Fear. Not fear of him, but of something else. Daniel exhaled sharply. This was wrong. This was all wrong. Humanity had fought this war to free people from Dominion oppression, not to become slavers themselves. He turned to his commanding officer, Colonel Reeves, who stood nearby watching the exchange. "This isn't right," Daniel said. "Tell them we don't accept this." Reeves didn't look surprised. Instead, he sighed and crossed his arms. "You think I like this? I don't. But we're walking a damn fine line here, Captain. The Dominion still has factions out there that could rise up. We need stability. We need them to accept the peace, and this is part of it." Daniel clenched his jaw. "So what? I just take her?" Reeves' eyes darkened. "Do what you want with her, but rejecting her outright might cause problems we don't need right now." Daniel felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He looked at Zyrella again, searching for some sign of resistance, of refusal, but she gave him none. Instead, she met his gaze and said words he would never forget. "I am yours now." Daniel's hands curled into fists. He had no idea why, but something about those words sent a chill down his spine. And deep down, he knew this was far from over. Daniel Carter sat in the dimly lit cabin of the transport ship, his mind caught in a storm of conflict. The steady hum of the engines vibrated through the metal walls as the ship soared across the wreckage-strewn orbit of the fallen Dominion world. Outside, through the reinforced viewport, the endless void stretched in all directions, speckled with the remnants of war, burning wreckage, broken starships, and the silent ghosts of those who had died in the last battle. Across from him, Zyrella sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Her silver hair cascaded over her shoulders, shimmering under the dim lights, while her violet eyes remained locked onto the floor. She had barely moved since boarding the ship, her posture unnervingly still, as though she were bracing for something inevitable. Daniel watched her for a moment before running a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. "This isn't right," he muttered under his breath. "This isn't what we fought for." Zyrella lifted her gaze slightly but said nothing. He leaned back in his seat, staring at the ceiling. He could still hear the words of Colonel Reeves echoing in his mind. "Do what you want with her, but rejecting her outright might cause problems we don't need right now." Problems. The Dominion had been crushed. Their fleets lay in ruin. Their ruling class had either been executed or surrendered. And yet, here he was, saddled with the last remnant of their empire, a woman who had been given to him like a trophy. He looked at her again, his stomach twisting. "I'm not keeping you," he finally said, breaking the silence between them. "Whatever your people think this is, it isn't happening. You're not my property. You're free." Zyrella didn't react. Not at first. But then, after a long pause, she finally spoke. "I cannot leave." Her voice was quiet, yet firm, carrying the weight that Daniel couldn't quite place. He narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean you can't leave?" "There's nothing stopping you. I can get you a ship. Get you somewhere safe." "There is nowhere safe for me," she interrupted, her voice still composed, but with a subtle undertone of finality. "I am bound to you now. If you release me, I will be hunted by my own people. They will see me as dishonored, exiled, worthless. I will have no place among them, no protection, no future." Daniel frowned. "So what? They kill you just because you're not someone's property." Zyrella's gaze was steady. "It is our way. To refuse my servitude is to cast me aside as a traitor. Even those who have surrendered do not break our traditions." Daniel let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "That's insane." She didn't respond. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the ship. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He had seen a lot during the war. He had watched entire colonies burn, seen men and women fight to their last breath. Rather than surrender, witnessed horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But this was something else. He had never considered what would happen after the war. He had been so focused on surviving, on winning, that he had never truly thought about the aftermath. About the cultures that had been shattered, the people who had to find a way to exist in a galaxy that had been irreversibly changed. And now, sitting across from him, was one of them. A woman who had lost everything, who had no choice but to follow a law that made her little more than a living artifact of a defeated empire. He clenched his jaw. "I'm not going to treat you like a slave," he said. "I don't care what your traditions say." Zyrella tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Then what will you do with me?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had no answer. The door to the cabin hissed open before he could find one. A soldier stepped inside, his face tight with unease. "Captain, we've got a situation." Daniel was on his feet in an instant. "What is it?" The soldier hesitated. "One of the Dominion prisoners tried to escape. We stopped him, but before we could take him down, he started shouting something." Daniel frowned. "Shouting what?" The soldier swallowed. He said, "We are not the last." A cold chill swept through the room. Daniel exchanged a glance with Zyrella, whose expression remained unreadable. Then, for the first time, he saw it. The faint flicker of something in her violet eyes. Fear. He took a slow step toward her. "What does that mean?" Zyrella hesitated. Then, finally, she spoke. "It means you have won a battle, not a war." The ship's alarms suddenly blared to life. Daniel's pulse spiked. "What the hell?" The comm system crackled. "Captain Carter, we have incoming vessels." Unidentified. Daniel's mind raced. The Dominion was broken. Their fleets were destroyed. There shouldn't be anyone left to fight. Unless. His gaze snapped back to Zyrella, and for the first time, he saw the truth in her expression. She had known this was coming. "You need to tell me what's going on," he said, his voice sharp. "Right now." Zyrella's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak, but before she could, the ship rocked violently. An explosion. The lights flickered. Daniel grabbed the edge of the seat to steady himself, his heart hammering in his chest. The war was supposed to be over. But something told him this was only the beginning. The ship shuddered under the force of another explosion, the metal groaning as if crying out in pain. The overhead lights flickered violently before stabilizing, but the red emergency signals pulsed like an ominous heartbeat throughout the corridors. Daniel Carter barely had time to process what was happening before the comms crackled again, the voice of the ship's pilot filled with panic. "Captain, we're under attack. 3 unidentified ships just dropped out of FTL. No transponders, no warning." Daniel clenched his jaw, his instincts kicking into overdrive. He turned sharply towards Zyrella, who stood unnervingly still, her violet eyes locked on the floor. "You knew," he said, his voice low and edged with tension. "You knew this was coming." She remained silent for a long moment before finally looking up at him. "I suspected," she admitted, "but I was not certain." Daniel's hands curled into fists. He had spent years in war, learning how to read people, how to sense deception. Zyrella wasn't lying. Not completely. She hadn't known the exact details, but she had expected something. He didn't have time to argue. The ship rocked again, and this time, the lights dimmed as power flickered. The engines were struggling. "We need to get to the bridge," Daniel snapped. He grabbed his rifle from where it rested near the bulkhead and turned to the soldier who had delivered the warning earlier. "Get a squad together and meet me at the command deck." The soldier saluted and rushed off, boots pounding against the floor as he disappeared down the hall. Daniel turned back to Zyrella. She remained poised, controlled, but he could see it now, the faint flicker of tension beneath the surface. "You're coming with me," he said firmly. "And this time, you're going to tell me everything." She nodded without hesitation. The corridors of the ship were a flurry of movement as Daniel led the way, gripping his rifle tightly. Marines ran past, heading toward defensive positions, while alarms continued to blare overhead. The ship's internal defenses were primed, but something about this attack felt different. It wasn't just a last-ditch effort from remnants of the Dominion. This was coordinated. Zyrella moved beside him effortlessly, her steps light and precise, almost as if she belonged in the chaos. "You can fight, can't you?" Daniel asked without looking at her. "I was trained," she admitted. "All nobles of the Dominion are." Daniel let out a dry laugh. "Nobles? You mean warriors." "It is the same thing in my culture," she replied, her voice steady. They reached the command deck just as the ship jolted again. This time, sparks rained from the ceiling, and a few consoles flickered and died. The pilot, a grizzled veteran named Anders, was gripping the controls so tightly that his knuckles were white. "They're trying to disable us," Anders shouted over the noise. "Whoever they are, they know exactly where to hit." Daniel stepped forward, scanning the external display. The attacking ships were sleek, dark, and unfamiliar, definitely not standard Dominion vessels. They moved with terrifying precision, weaving between the wreckage of the battlefield with an almost predatory grace. Zyrella stiffened beside him. Daniel turned to her. "Who are they?" For the first time since meeting her, she hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "They are not Dominion." A cold realization settled over Daniel. The Dominion had been the enemy for so long that it was easy to assume they were the worst threat in the galaxy. But if these ships didn't belong to them, then that meant this war was bigger than he had ever imagined. An explosion ripped through the side of the ship, throwing Daniel forward. He hit the console hard, barely managing to keep himself from falling. The emergency systems kicked in, sealing off the damaged sections, but he could already hear the alarms screaming in warning. "We have incoming boarding craft," one of the officers shouted. Daniel gritted his teeth. "Of course we do." The external cameras showed 3 small assault pods breaking away from the enemy vessels, angling toward the ship's hull at alarming speed. "They're coming in fast," Anders called. "We can't shoot them all down in time." Daniel turned to the security officer. "Where are they going to breach?" The officer quickly analyzed the ship's schematics before swearing under his breath. "Starboard cargo bay, deck 4. Daniel checked his rifle. "Let's go." He started toward the exit, but before he could reach it, a hand grabbed his arm. He turned sharply to find Zyrella staring at him, her grip surprisingly strong. "You don't understand," she said, her voice urgent. "These are not just soldiers. They are hunters." Daniel yanked his arm free. "Then we'll give them something to hunt." The cargo bay was already in chaos by the time Daniel arrived with his squad. The first boarding pod had breached the hull, and smoke filled the room as the atmosphere struggled to stabilize. Then, out of the smoke, the enemy emerged. They were tall, humanoid, but with elongated limbs and armor that seemed to shift like liquid metal. Their eyes glowed a deep, unnatural red, and they moved with an eerie, predatory silence. They carried weapons unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. Sleek, almost organic-looking rifles that crackled with energy. The first shot rang out, and the battle erupted. Daniel dropped into cover as the enemy unleashed a hail of plasma fire, their shots burning through metal like paper. His Marines returned fire, but the attackers moved unnaturally fast, dodging bullets with terrifying efficiency. One of the creatures leaped over a barricade, slamming into a Marine and ripping his weapon from his hands. Before the man could react, the creature drove a blade into his chest, killing him instantly. Daniel fired, hitting the attacker square in the head. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it turned its glowing eyes on him, as if analyzing him. Then it smiled. Daniel fired again, this time at the chest. The impact sent the creature stumbling backward, and before it could recover, a blur of silver and blue moved past him. Zyrella. She moved with lethal precision, drawing a hidden blade from her sleeve and slashing across the creature's throat in one fluid motion. A strange, dark liquid sprayed from the wound, and the attacker collapsed. Daniel stared at her, stunned. She met his gaze, breathing heavily. "Now you see." Another explosion rocked the ship. Daniel didn't have time to process what had just happened. The battle wasn't over yet. "Fall back to the armory," he ordered. "We make our stand there." His Marines followed him, but as they retreated, Daniel caught one final glance at the fallen enemy. It wasn't Dominion. It wasn't human. And worst of all, it had been smiling. The war was over, but the real fight had just begun. The emergency lighting bathed the corridors in a flickering red glow as Daniel and his squad moved swiftly through the ship, their boots pounding against the metal flooring. The cargo bay was a war zone, but it wouldn't be the last. Whoever these attackers were, they weren't just here to kill. They were here to hunt, to claim something. Or someone. Zyrella moved alongside him, her silver hair whipping behind her as she kept pace with the soldiers. Despite the chaos, she moved with a silent grace that unnerved him. She had already proven herself in the cargo bay. Her blade had cut through the enemy with precision and efficiency, far beyond anything he had expected from someone who had been presented to him as a prize. Daniel clenched his jaw, his mind racing. They had minutes, maybe less, before the enemy breached again. The ship's internal defenses were barely holding, and the enemy had already proven they were stronger, faster, and more coordinated than anything humanity had faced before. As they reached the armory, Daniel turned sharply, grabbing Zyrella's arm and pulling her aside. The others rushed past, securing the area, but he needed answers. "Now, you're going to tell me everything," he said, voice low but firm. "Who are they?" Zyrella's violet eyes flickered with hesitation, but only for a moment. "They are the Draeken." The name sent a chill through Daniel's spine. It wasn't one he had ever heard before, not in the countless intelligence briefings he had sat through during the war. He had memorized every major Dominion species, every faction that had opposed humanity, and yet Draeken had never come up. "Who the hell are the Draeken?" he demanded. Zyrella exhaled, as if letting go of something she had carried for too long. "They were here before the Dominion, before even my ancestors ruled the stars. They are not conquerors. They are not warriors." She hesitated before finishing in a quiet, almost haunted voice. "They are slavers." Daniel felt a wave of nausea twist in his gut. "Slavers." She nodded. "Not in the way you understand. They do not take prisoners for labor, nor do they occupy worlds. They take lives, entire species, and break them, shape them. They turn them into tools, into weapons. They do not seek victory, only submission." Daniel processed her words, his grip tightening around his rifle. "Then why haven't we heard of them before? If they're so powerful, where the hell have they been?" Zyrella's gaze darkened. "Because the Dominion erased them." Daniel's breath hitched. The Dominion had been one of the most ruthless regimes in the galaxy, but even they had records, archives, historical documentation spanning centuries. The idea that they had simply deleted an entire enemy from existence was disturbing. "They fought a war against the Draeken thousands of years ago," Zyrella continued. "It nearly destroyed my people. We won, but only barely. The cost was too great, and so the Dominion did what they do best. They rewrote history. They erased every trace of the Draken's existence, buried every record, burned every world they had once touched. They made them into nothing but whispers, myths, legends that would fade over time." Daniel's fingers twitched. "And now they're back." Zyrella nodded. "They never left. They simply waited." The ship shuddered violently as another explosion rattled through its structure. The overhead lights flickered before stabilizing, and Daniel could hear distant shouts from the Marines securing the entrance to the armory. "Then why now?" he asked, keeping his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "What do they want?" Zyrella's silence was more telling than any answer. Daniel took a step closer. "Zyrella." She looked away. It is not a coincidence that they appeared now. Not a coincidence that they found us, on this ship, at this exact time. Daniel's mind pieced it together faster than he wanted to believe. They're not here for the ship, he realized. They're here for you. Zyrella's hands clenched at her sides. They have been watching, waiting for the Dominion to fall. And now that they have, there is nothing left to stop them. No empire, no military power strong enough to keep them in the dark. And she hesitated. I am the last daughter of the Dominion's ruling bloodline. Their final trophy. The one prize they have sought for centuries. Daniel stared at her. They want you as a slave. Zyrella's lips pressed into a thin line. Not just as a slave. As a symbol. Daniel understood now. The Dominion had spent generations wiping out every trace of the Draeken, forcing them into hiding, ensuring they were nothing but forgotten ghosts. If the Draeken could break the last hair of the Dominion, if they could parade her before the galaxy in chains, then they wouldn't just reclaim their place in history. They would send a message. A message that no empire, no species, no power in the galaxy was beyond their reach. Daniel's stomach twisted. He had spent years fighting the Dominion, hating them, pushing humanity to victory against their tyranny. But this was something else. The sounds of distant gunfire snapped him back to reality. The Marines at the entrance to the armory were already exchanging shots with the incoming Draeken forces. He could hear the heavy thud of their footsteps, the mechanical hiss of their shifting armor as they advanced with terrifying precision. "Captain," one of the Marines shouted, "we can't hold them for long." Daniel turned back to Zyrella. "You're not going with them," he said firmly. Her gaze snapped to his. "You cannot stop them. Watch me." Daniel stepped forward, raising his rifle as the first Draeken soldier stepped through the breached hull. The creature's red eyes glowed as it spotted him. But Daniel didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger, sending a burst of plasma rounds straight into the enemy's chest. The creature staggered, but unlike before, it didn't smile. It fell. Daniel exhaled sharply, but there was no time to celebrate. More of them were coming. "We need to get off this ship," he called out to his squad. "Now." Anders' voice crackled through the comms. "Captain, the enemy ships are swarming us. We've got one emergency drop pod left. If you're getting out, now's the time." Daniel grabbed Zyrella's wrist. "We're leaving." She didn't resist. They ran. The ship trembled around them as the Draeken forces tore through its defenses, but Daniel didn't look back. The only thing that mattered now was survival, because the war he had fought was over. But the war that was coming, it was just beginning. The emergency drop pod shuddered violently as it ripped away from the crippled human warship, plunging into the darkness of space like a stone sinking into a bottomless ocean. Daniel Carter braced himself against the metal walls, gripping the safety straps as turbulence rattled through the pod. The reinforced viewport showed the chaos unfolding outside. The Draeken ships circling the doomed warship like predatory beasts, their dark, shifting hulls absorbing the light around them. Zyrella sat across from him, her violet eyes locked on the viewport, her face set in unreadable calm. He didn't know how she could remain so composed after what they had just survived. The Draeken had nearly taken her, nearly erased every last trace of the Dominion's once mighty legacy by dragging her into their endless cycle of enslavement. And yet she sat there, her breathing even, her body still. Daniel wanted to say something, anything, but the moment was shattered as the pod's alarm blared. The trajectory was off. "We're coming in too fast." Anders' voice crackled through the comms. Damn pod took some hits, guidance systems barely holding together. Brace for hard impact. The pod lurched violently as it entered the atmosphere of the planet below, friction igniting the outer shell in a blinding cascade of fire. Daniel clenched his teeth, feeling the heat pressing in despite the reinforced structure. They were dropping toward a dense, mountainous region, far from any known human colonies. Not that they had a choice. The impact hit like a sledgehammer. The pod smashed through thick layers of trees before finally slamming into the rocky terrain below. The force of the landing sent Daniel's vision spinning, and for a moment, all he could hear was the shriek of torn metal and the crackle of burning debris. Silence followed. Daniel coughed, blinking through the haze of smoke and dust. His body ached from the impact, but nothing felt broken. He turned to Zyrella. She was already pulling herself free from the restraints, her movements controlled, precise. "You okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded once. "I am unharmed." Of course she was. She had moved through battle like a specter, cutting down Draeken warriors with the efficiency of a trained killer. There was more to her than she had let on, and Daniel knew he'd have to address that sooner rather than later. The pod's interior was a mess of sparking consoles and broken equipment. Anders' voice crackled over the comms again. "Carter, you still breathing down there?" "Barely," Daniel muttered. "Status?" "Not good," Anders admitted. "We got out just in time, but the warship didn't make it. The Draken wiped it from the sky." Daniel exhaled sharply. Survivors. Some of the crew escaped on separate pods. Others didn't make it. There was a grim silence before Anders continued. "We're scattered across this damn planet. I'll try to get a signal out, but if the Draken follow us—" "They will," Zyrella interrupted. Daniel glanced at her, but she wasn't looking at him. She was staring out through the viewport, her expression unreadable. Anders sighed. "That's what I was afraid of. We need to regroup fast. Sending you coordinates to my crash site. Get here as soon as you can." The signal cut out. Daniel checked his rifle, then turned to Zyrella. "We move now." She nodded, and together, they forced the hatch open, stepping into the unknown. The landscape stretched before them, vast and unforgiving. Jagged cliffs loomed in the distance, their peaks disappearing into mist, while dense forests sprawled toward the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something faint but unmistakable. Zyrella stiffened. "They are coming," she murmured. Daniel followed her gaze toward the darkening sky. Shapes moved against the clouds, barely visible but unmistakably alien. The Draken had followed them. Daniel tightened his grip on his rifle. "Then we better move fast." They moved swiftly through the forest, the uneven terrain forcing Daniel to rely on instincts honed through years of combat. Zyrella moved beside him, her presence unnervingly silent, as if she belonged in the shadows. It wasn't long before they heard them. The Draken didn't march like soldiers. They didn't stomp through the undergrowth like lumbering brutes. They moved like whispers, their elongated limbs shifting unnaturally, their presence a mere suggestion of movement until it was too late. Daniel stopped suddenly, raising a fist. Zyrella halted beside him. "3 of them," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Circling us." Daniel adjusted his rifle. "We take them out fast." Zyrella reached for the hidden blade strapped to her thigh. Agreed. The moment stretched. Then, a blur of motion. Daniel fired, his plasma rounds searing through the darkness. The Draken lunged, their shifting armor absorbing some of the impact, but not all of it. One collapsed, hissing as dark liquid seeped from its wounds. The other 2 moved too fast. One was nearly on top of Daniel before a flash of silver cut through the air. Zyrella moved with terrifying speed, her blade slicing clean through the creature's throat. The Draken gurgled, its glowing eyes flickering before it collapsed. The last one hesitated. Then it spoke. "You cannot run forever." Daniel raised his rifle. "We're not running." He pulled the trigger. The final Draken fell. Silence. Daniel exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow. "They're testing us," he muttered. "They're not sending their full forces yet." Zyrella nodded. "They are watching, studying, learning how we fight." Daniel didn't like the sound of that. He turned back toward the cliffs. "Then we don't give them time. We reach Anders and figure out our next move." They ran. Hours passed in a blur of movement, the terrain growing harsher as they neared the rendezvous point. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the valley below. And that was when they saw it. The wreckage of another pod. Anders' pod. Daniel's stomach twisted. We're too late. Zyrella stepped forward, scanning the area with sharp eyes. No, she said. Not too late. Daniel followed her gaze. Figures moved in the distance. Not Draeken. Not humans. Something else. Zyrella inhaled sharply. Exiled warriors. Daniel frowned. Who? They were cast out from the Dominion long ago, she explained. Warriors who refused to kneel to my ancestors. Mercenaries. Outcasts. But if they are here... She turned to Daniel. We may have just found unlikely allies. Daniel wasn't sure whether to be relieved or even more worried. But one thing was certain. The real fight was only just beginning. Daniel crouched low in the dense underbrush, his rifle steady as he surveyed the valley below. The wreckage of Anders' escape pod lay scattered across the rocky terrain, smoke curling into the dimming sky. The sun had nearly set, casting the landscape into a deep orange glow, making the jagged cliffs surrounding the valley appear like the sharpened teeth of some slumbering beast. But it wasn't the wreckage that had Daniel on edge. It was the figures moving between the shadows. The exiled warriors. Zyrella had recognized them immediately, her voice carrying an unreadable weight when she had uttered their name. The Kethari. Daniel had fought many enemies in his time. Dominion soldiers, pirates, mercenaries, but these were different. Their armor was a patchwork of old Dominion technology and scavenged human gear, reinforced with hardened bone plating that had been etched with strange markings. Some carried Dominion plasma rifles, others human weapons, while a few bore blades that shimmered with an unnatural glow. They were warriors who had abandoned the Dominion long before humanity's war with them had begun. Unlike Zyrella, who had been born into noble blood, these were the castaways, the broken, the dishonored, the remnants of a forgotten past. And now, they were standing over the wreckage of Anders' pod. Daniel's stomach twisted as he scanned the area. No sign of Anders or any other survivors. Were they taken? Killed? He had no way of knowing. Then he felt Zyrella move beside him, her presence unusually still. They will not take kindly to us, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel exhaled slowly, shifting his grip on his rifle. Yeah, I figured that much. Zyrella turned her gaze to him. They may kill you on sight. You are human. Daniel gave her a wry smirk. Then I'll try not to make a bad first impression. Before she could respond, movement below caught their attention. One of the Kethari warriors raised a hand, signaling to the others. A moment later, a body was dragged into view. Anders. Blood trickled from a deep gash along his forehead, but he was alive. His arms were bound, his face bruised, but his eyes still burned with defiance as two Kethari held him in place. Daniel's grip tightened. We need a plan, he said. Zyrella studied the scene below. I may be able to negotiate. Daniel frowned. Negotiate? You just said they won't take kindly to us. Zyrella nodded. But I am still of Dominion blood. That may give me enough leverage to speak before they decide to kill us. Daniel considered the options. Charging in guns blazing would be suicide. There were too many of them, and he doubted even Zyrella's combat skills would be enough to turn the tide. A diplomatic approach was risky, but it was their best chance at getting Anders out alive. All right, he said. We do it your way. They moved carefully, stepping out from the cover of the trees and descending toward the valley. The moment they emerged, weapons were raised. Kethari warriors snapped to attention, their rifles aimed directly at them, their sharp, predatory eyes narrowing. Daniel kept his hands visible, but he remained ready to move. One of the Kethari stepped forward. He was larger than the others, his armor more intricate, adorned with the skull of some long-dead beast. His eyes, dark and piercing, settled on Zyrella first. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, In a voice that was both deep and heavy with disdain, he spoke. Dominion blood still walks the stars. Zyrella held her ground. I am no longer of the Dominion. The warrior let out a low chuckle, spoken like a coward who lost her throne. Daniel tensed, but Zyrella remained composed. I did not lose my throne, she said. It was stolen, just as your honor was stolen from you when you were cast out. A murmur rippled through the gathered warriors. The leader's expression darkened. You are bold, he said, and foolish. Zyrella tilted her head slightly. Yet you have not killed me. That means you still wish to hear what I have to say. The warrior's nostrils flared, but he did not deny it. Daniel decided it was time to step in. Your men captured one of ours, he said, nodding toward Anders. We want him back. The warrior turned his gaze to Daniel, his expression twisting into something close to amusement. And why should I give him to you, human? Daniel met his gaze evenly. Because we're not your enemy. And if you're smart, you'll realize we have a much bigger problem right now. The warrior's amusement faded. The Draeken, he said, voice laced with disgust. Zyrella nodded. They are coming, and they will not care if you are Dominion or human. They will enslave you all the same. The warrior was silent for a long moment. Then he gestured, and Anders was shoved forward. Daniel caught him before he fell, helping him stay on his feet. Appreciate the hospitality, Anders muttered, spitting blood onto the ground. The warrior studied Daniel for another moment before speaking again. If you speak truth, then we share a common enemy, but do not mistake that for trust. If you betray us, we will not hesitate to carve your hearts from your chests. Daniel smirked. Fair enough. Then the sky split open. The first Draeken warship descended through the atmosphere like a descending god of war, its dark hull casting a massive shadow over the valley. The warriors below immediately tensed, their weapons snapping toward the sky. Daniel's blood ran cold. It was happening. The Draeken had come. A deafening roar filled the air as the ship unleashed a torrent of energy fire, tearing through the valley like a blade through flesh. Warriors scattered, diving for cover as explosions tore the earth apart. The ground shook violently, and Daniel barely managed to grab Anders and Zyrella, pulling them behind a jagged rock for cover. The Draeken soldiers descended like specters, their forms twisting unnaturally as they landed, weapons drawn. There was no more time for negotiations. Daniel raised his rifle. Looks like we're all on the same side now, he called to the Ketheri leader. The warrior grinned, revealing sharp teeth. Then let us see if humans fight, as well as they boast. And just like that, the battle for survival began. Blades met plasma. Bullets tore through the air. The Draeken moved like shadows, weaving between attacks with supernatural speed, but the Ketheri fought like animals, their savagery unmatched. Daniel fired relentlessly, his rounds finding purchase in Draeken bodies, but they did not fall easily. It took precision, it took fury, it took everything. And still, the warship above loomed. We can't hold forever. Anders shouted over the chaos. Daniel's mind raced. If they didn't find a way to take that warship down, this battle was already lost. Then Zyrella spoke. There is one way. Daniel turned to her. I'm listening. She held his gaze. We take the war to them. Daniel grinned despite the chaos around them. Now that sounds like a plan. The battle had only just begun. The valley burned. Fire and smoke twisted into the darkened sky, casting eerie shadows over the battlefield. The Ketheri warriors fought like demons, their savage strikes cutting down the Draeken invaders with brutal efficiency. Yet for every enemy that fell, more descended from the warship above, their sleek, black armor shifting unnaturally as they moved with an eerie, predatory grace. Daniel Carter fired another shot, his rifle glowing hot from overuse. The plasma round struck a Draeken square in the chest, sending the creature sprawling, but it wasn't dead. It twitched, its red eyes glowing with unnatural intensity before it slowly began to rise. Son of a... Daniel muttered, switching to his sidearm and firing 3 rapid shots into its head. The Draken finally collapsed, its body convulsing before going still. "Captain," Anders shouted over the chaos, "we can't hold much longer." Daniel knew he was right. Even with the Ketheri fighting beside them, they were outnumbered and outgunned. The warship above them loomed like an omen of death, its shadow casting everything beneath it in darkness. Then, as if to punctuate their desperation, the ship's main weapon powered up. A deep hum filled the air, and the ground beneath them trembled. Daniel didn't need to be told what was about to happen. "They're going to wipe the whole damn valley," Anders yelled. Daniel's mind raced. There had to be a way out of this, some way to turn the tide before the Draken wiped them from existence. Zyrella moved beside him, her violet eyes burning with something unreadable. "We must get aboard the warship." Daniel turned to her, his breath coming hard and fast. "Are you insane? That thing is crawling with Draken." She didn't flinch. "It is the only way. If we take control of the ship, we can turn their weapons against them." Daniel glanced at the battlefield. The Ketheri were holding their ground, but they were losing. The Draken were relentless, their movements impossibly fast, their weapons deadly. If that warship fired, none of them would be left standing. "How the hell do we even get up there?" Anders asked, dodging a blast of energy fire. Zyrella's gaze remained steady. "There is a way." Daniel met her eyes. "I'm guessing it's a bad plan." "It is the only plan." He sighed, already regretting what he was about to say. "All right, let's do it." Zyrella turned to the Ketheri leader, her voice sharp. "We need an aerial ship, something fast enough to breach their defenses." The Ketheri warrior let out a low growl. "You ask much, Dominion Princess. If we do not stop them now," she said, "they will return. Again and again. And next time, there will be no warriors left to fight them." The leader considered her words before nodding. With a sharp command, a battered but functional gunship was prepared. Daniel, Anders, and Zyrella climbed aboard as the battle raged below. The ship's engines roared to life, and they shot toward the sky, dodging enemy fire as they ascended. The warship grew larger as they approached, its dark hull stretching endlessly into the night. "Hold on," Anders called as he maneuvered through the storm of incoming fire. The gunship shuddered violently as they neared the docking bay, the shields barely holding against the barrage of enemy blasts. At the last moment, Anders yanked the controls hard, sending them into a sharp dive before leveling out just as they breached the enemy's hangar bay. The ship crashed hard, skidding across the metal floor before finally coming to a stop. Smoke billowed from the engines, but they were alive. "Move, move, move," Daniel shouted, unstrapping himself and jumping to his feet. Draeken soldiers were already advancing, their weapons primed. Zyrella was the first to move, her blade flashing as she cut through the nearest enemy. Daniel and Anders opened fire, covering her as they pushed forward. They had one goal: the bridge. The corridors of the ship were eerily silent, save for the distant hum of machinery. It was unsettling how quickly the chaos of battle had faded once they stepped inside. "This place gives me the creeps," Anders muttered. Daniel nodded. "Stay sharp." They moved swiftly, cutting down any Draken that crossed their path. The closer they got to the bridge, the stronger the unsettling feeling in Daniel's gut became. Then they reached the doors. A massive chamber lay beyond, filled with dark technology, pulsing red lights, and a single figure standing at the center. The Draken commander. It turned slowly, its glowing red eyes locking onto them. Unlike the others, it was taller, its armor thicker, its presence more imposing. "You are persistent," it said in a voice that sent chills down Daniel's spine. "But you are too late." Daniel raised his rifle. "Yeah, we'll see about that." The commander didn't move. Instead, it raised one hand. The room shifted. Daniel barely had time to react before an unseen force slammed into him, throwing him back against the wall. His vision blurred as pain lanced through his skull. Zyrella lunged, her blade flashing, but the commander caught her mid-strike, its clawed fingers tightening around her wrist. "You were always meant to kneel," it hissed. Zyrella struggled, but the commander was too strong. Daniel forced himself to his feet, his vision swimming. He saw Anders on the ground, unmoving. No. He gritted his teeth. He wouldn't let it end like this. Summoning every last ounce of strength, he grabbed his sidearm and fired. The first shot missed. The second hit the commander in the shoulder, making it snarl. The third hit its head. The Draeken staggered. Zyrella seized the moment. She twisted free, driving her blade straight into the commander's throat. It let out a strangled gasp. Then it fell. The red glow in its eyes faded. Silence. Daniel stumbled forward, his breath ragged. He looked at Zyrella. She was breathing hard, her expression unreadable. Anders groaned from the floor, pushing himself up. "Did we win?" Daniel let out a breathless chuckle. "I think so." Then the ship shook. They set the ship to self-destruct, Zyrella realized. "Of course they did," Anders muttered. Daniel turned to the control panel. "Can we override it?" Zyrella studied it for a moment before shaking her head. "No, but we can crash it." Daniel raised a brow. "Into what?" She met his gaze. "Their fleet." Daniel grinned. "Now that's a plan." Zyrella worked quickly, rerouting the ship's systems. Alarms blared, and the warship's trajectory shifted. They ran. They'd barely made it to the escape pods before the ship lurched violently. As they ejected, they watched as the warship plunged toward the Draeken fleet, a blazing meteor of destruction. The impact was blinding. The Draeken fleet shattered. Daniel exhaled slowly as their pod drifted toward the planet below. The war wasn't over, but it was a damn good start. He looked at Zyrella. "Guess you're stuck with us now." She gave him a small, almost amused smile. "I suppose I am." As the pod descended, Daniel knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning.